Clemson and Alabama. That game kicks off at 8 o'clock, 5 o'clock Pacific time. That's the clock that I've been on, just coming out of the annual Football Writers Association of America breakfast and a conversation with Mel Tucker. And I will have some of that conversation up on video for you on Dog Nation here in a little bit following this Ingles on the Beat segment. Each Monday, we come to you sponsored by Ingles. Want to check that out, your neighborhood supermarket. Appreciate the sponsorship and support. And today I'll share some news from you on Georgia football. Started this morning with the release of the 18th annual Freshman All-American team. Georgia leading the nation with 3 players on the FWAA Freshman All-American team. Those players are Cade Mays on the offensive line, the true freshman from Knoxville. We look down at the list. Isaiah Wilson, the redshirt freshman from Brooklyn, New York. And, of course, Jordan Davis, a guy who emerged the second half of the year. And Mel Tucker just now telling me about Jordan Davis, the size, the inability of teams to move him, and just what a big benefit that was to Georgia football in the front seven when young Jordan Davis emerged this season. Of course, Jordan didn't play in the Sugar Bowl. He injured his back during weightlifting. That was a big factor in Texas' ability to run the ball successfully. Talking with Coach Tucker, he said he did watch the Sugar Bowl, said it was hard to watch. He still supports Georgia, obviously, and has a lot to say about those coaches and those players that he coached. And, of course, now he's on to Colorado. This freshman All-American team, there were 6 guys from the SEC there. Georgia had 2 guys on the team last year, if you'll remember. Jake Fromm was the freshman All-American quarterback, and Andrew Thomas was on the offensive line. So you look at just how much Sam Pittman's done. You're talking about 3 guys making the freshman All-American team in the last 2 years. And this Georgia offensive line this year, one of the 3 finalists for the Joe Moore Award, which goes to the best offensive line in college football. Now, Oklahoma won that. Alabama was the other finalist, and Georgia were the 3 finalists. Oklahoma ended up winning it. But Georgia bringing back 4 guys on their offensive line that are starters. The future's bright. When you look at left tackle and Andrew Thomas and left guard Solomon Kinley, not sure who's going to be center yet. Could it be Clay Webb? Not so sure. Right guard Cade Mays, right tackle Isaiah Wilson. I mean, they're all coming back in force. And, Jamari Saylor going to be in the mix, Trey Hill. There's so much talent. Georgia's offensive line, arguably the best in the country going into next year. And I know it was hard on Friday with all those defections. I was here in California writing the press releases, and Connor Riley was jumping in there writing them, Chip Towers, as we were all trying to keep up. We didn't have any idea that they would all happen on that day and happen in succession so quickly. Juniors have until July 14th to make up their minds. So when Isaac Nauta decided, that wasn't really such a surprise. Isaac is a guy that, quite frankly, how much better can he get from his junior to his senior year? And I'm not sure where he'll go in the draft order. I don't think any of these young men who declared early are going to go in the first 2 rounds and maybe not the first 3 rounds. A lot of it will depend on combine testing for a lot of these players. But Isaac's a guy that is going to have to prove he can block the bigger guys. He's maybe a little undersized when you think about blocking tight ends in the NFL. And then we'll see how he matches up when he gets moved out into the slot. How will he compare with some of these faster DBs in the league that are going to cover him? Mecole Hardman, McColl's decision, I could sort of understand. McColl's a speed guy. He's like a Gabriel or Tyreek Hill. He needs to run that low 4.3 number to move into the first 2 or 3 rounds. Still has some work to do on his route running and catching the football. But, boy, he started this year on fire. Clearly, he could be an impact guy on special teams in the NFL. And keep an eye on his combine number. That's going to mean everything to Mecole Hardman, what he runs in the 40, how he does in those shuttle drills. He looks so quick and so explosive. Probably could have benefited from another year at Georgia, but if he runs the right number, he's a guy that's going to skyrocket in value in the NFL as we're starting to see more of those speed guys out there now. Elijah Holyfield, over 1,000 yards this season. Man, did he run hard. Certainly one of the best conditioned guys. He's known as pound for pound the strongest man on the Georgia football team. I don't expect his work ethic will change. I think Elijah will make a roster, because he's the kind of guy who can do so many different things. He can make it on special teams. He can give you another tough, reliable back in your backfield. You know what you're going to get from him. He worked very hard to improve his pass sketching and pass blocking skills this year. Thought he took a big leap. Could he have gotten a little bigger and a little faster another year at Georgia? Probably. But would he have rushed for 1,000 yards next year? I'm not so sure. This was a very special year for Elijah, with DeAndre Swift being slowed by injury, and of course Amir White was also out. James White, just a freshman, would have been hard, I think, for Elijah to get 1,000 yards next year. I think he would have been an extremely valuable part of Georgia, and they're going to have to replace his leadership because he was a guy that so many people looked up to. So, personally, a little disappointed, but happy for Elijah. This is his dream, and he has worked extremely hard for it. So hard to second guess his decision there. Riley Ridley is a guy that we all kind of thought might go pro. Obviously, we've seen what his brother Calvin can do in the NFL. I expect Riley is a guy who will fare really well when it comes to the metrics and the combine. He's a guy that could work his way into the second or third round as well. Another guy that maybe could have benefited from another year. But again, the thing to remember is if the players don't want to be there, then they don't need to be there. If they have a second thought about all the work and commitment they have to make, and they'd really rather be somewhere else, the last thing you want is a guy in August second guessing his decision to be on the team. Because as we saw with the Sugar Bowl, if everyone's not on board, if everyone's not dialed in, it's just not the same Georgia. And I look at the Sugar Bowl, as many people are disappointed with the result. I look at it a little differently. It makes me want to give this team a lot more credit for what they did during the regular season, because you saw just how small the margin for error really is. When everybody's not on board, uh, Georgia's not the same football team as they were through the SEC title game, when everyone was so committed, everybody was so dialed in, everyone was so bought in. But all of a sudden you get a guy or two that's not playing because of NFL draft stock. And listen, I'm not blaming anybody for that. That's a professional decision that these guys have to make. We saw some seniors play that were first round prospects in the College Bowl season, linebacker at LSU. We saw other guys that didn't. DB at LSU, and obviously DeAndre Baker. It absolutely affects the team. I wonder a little bit about DeAndre Walker. He's a guy we'll see compete in the Senior Bowl here. That's going to be really big for Walker. He's a guy who I think the second half of the senior season really shot up even more in the draft. His performance in the SEC championship game, unbelievable. He was living in the Alabama backfield when you looked at how he produced. And talking with Mel Tucker just a few minutes ago, when DeAndre Walker went out of that SEC title game, that's when things started to go bad. Now, give Jalen Hurts credit, as I've said, but DeAndre Walker was living in that backfield. He was making a huge difference, and him leaving that game, I believe, affected the outcome of the SEC title game. So it's been a very busy time for Georgia. I know there's a lot of rumors right now. It's hard to separate the truth from fiction, particularly when it comes to Jim Chaney, where his contract's expired. Is he going anywhere? We don't know. Georgia hasn't put out any comments on it. My thought was that the second half of the year, I felt like Kirby went out of his way to give Jim a lot of credit for a lot of the things he did. You look at the third down efficiency. You look at Georgia's ability against Alabama these last 2 years. I dare say I don't think Georgia lost those games on offense. When you score that many points against the Crimson Tide and you've got that sort of lead, it's kind of up to your defense, to be able to hold that lead. I think Jim Chaney, if he were to leave, would be extremely difficult to replace for Kirby. Not saying it can't be done. Certainly Jake Fromm comes back, a very talented guy. We talked about that offensive line, Swift in the backfield. There is some talent at wide receiver, albeit maybe not as proven as some of the guys that are leaving, but there's still some talent there with guys like J.J. Holloman, Tyler Simmons. These guys are difference makers, and once they get their opportunity, Demetrius Robertson, I would expect another guy. So it's a very attractive offense, and that's kind of why part of me is like, well, wait a minute, does Jim Chaney really want to leave that? Is this the year to leave that when you've got Jake Fromm, an experienced quarterback that's able to do so many things for you? Again, I don't know the particulars of the contract and who's out there trying to hire Jim Chaney, or if he has any desire to leave. This is information right now that's kind of just out there in space on the internet, and it'd be irresponsible for me to say one way or the other. But sitting from where I'm sitting, I haven't heard anything yet out here in California. I've talked to a lot of people, and I haven't heard anything decisive one way or the other. And it's trying time for Georgia fans when you've got juniors going pro, when you talk about Mel Tucker leaving to be the head coach at Colorado. Now the rumors around Jim Chaney and his contract not being done, or no announcement that it's renewed. It does kind of shake up a fan base a little bit. I've seen this before at championship programs that I've covered, and It's just part of it. When you have the talent that Georgia has accrued, and when you hire the coaches that Kirby has been able to hire and have success with, they're going to go on and be successful. And we've seen the Alabama model. We've seen how Nick Saban has been able to continue to have success, regardless of who the coordinators are. And that was one reason why I championed Nick Saban for the head coach of the year this year, because he had two new coordinators, and yet and still Alabama was the most dominant regular season SEC team in history. They were rolling teams by an average of 35.2 points per game, and that's why what Georgia did was so darn impressive. And the way Georgia improved, and just that front seven on defense, the way it grew. By the end of the year, they did a great job against Alabama. That secondary, arguably the best in the country. You saw Georgia's best against Alabama. You certainly didn't see it against Texas. Georgia wasn't dialed in. They didn't have the same level of motivation that Texas. I mean, at some point, it's human nature. Now, it's not an excuse, and Kirby Smart is not going to say this is okay. Kirby talked to these players about legacy. He talked to them about a standard. And I know he's disappointed that he didn't feel they played up to their standard that night. And it was a lesson for a lot of those young players that played in the game. So some good can come of that for Georgia football. Remember also, next year's national championship game will be in that same building in New Orleans. The fact that these players have played there before, should they get to that game, will be a huge advantage for Georgia. Also, they've done New Orleans. They've done the sightseeing. They go there next year, probably not going to see as many off the field junkets or ventures. And certainly in a playoff, a head coach is going to treat that differently as well. So those are some of my takes on the players leaving, some of my takes on the coaching staff, the bowl game. You saw Dwan Mathis. I'll tell you a little bit about my visit with Dwan. Dwan is a young man he lives in Romulus, Michigan, which is right by the Detroit airport. It's a good 15, 20 minutes outside the city. Now, when he was young, he was in inner city Detroit. And then the dad moved out to the suburb, and he lives with his father, who's a retired law enforcement officer. The household was warm and inviting. This family is very excited about Georgia. The interesting thing is that Dwan came there in July of 2017, came down to Georgia on a visit. And back then, you had Jacob Eason and Jake Fromm on the team. And Dwan said that even though Fields wasn't committed there, that was the buzz, and he kind of thought Fields would end up there. So that's kind of when Georgia came off his list, because certainly that was a quarterback situation where he wasn't going to be able to play very early, and competing would have been very difficult with Eason, Fromm, and Fields. It wasn't hard for him to figure that out, but he really liked it. He really enjoyed his time in Georgia. He really enjoyed the facilities. He was in the indoor facility when it was just built. That was an attraction. And by the way, I will have a long story on Dwan with about 25 minutes of video, Dwan talking about a lot of these things. I'm just kind of trying to give you the Cliff Notes version. I know a lot of people want to know about the Justin Fields thing. Well, here's the deal. Dwan did call Ohio State on signing day and asked them if they'd been talking to Justin Fields, and Ohio State told him no. And I can't speak for whether or not Ohio State was in fact talking to Justin Fields, or they weren't, or if the coach that he spoke to was honest or wasn't. But I will say this for Dwan. He hung up the phone and he went to social media and looked on Twitter. And he said he could tell reading the social media post that there was some fire behind all that smoke. And in his dealings with the Georgia coaches, again, Jim Chaney and Coley, he felt an immediate trust and bond with these coaches. He felt like Georgia was up front with him. They told him about his opportunities with Jake Fromm and what would be expected of him. Upon an early enrollment, Dwan had to take care of business. So Georgia kind of took a chance on him. Dwan was still finishing up those 4 online classes he took this fall. So Georgia reached out and showed faith in Dwan with that offer. And Dwan showed faith in Georgia with signing with the Bulldogs, even as Ohio State was telling him that they hadn't talked to Justin Fields. And yes, he's very well aware that people are critical, that, when he was very young, it was Iowa State. And then he thought he was going to Michigan State. Well, guess what? Michigan State's dropped off. And all you got to do is look at their offensive line this season and what happened to the Spartans' offense. So Ohio State came along. It was a better offer and a better situation. Suddenly, at the last minute, the Ohio State situation changes. I can tell you this about Dwan Mathis. This is not a kid that's going to run and run away from competition, that's going to jump if the circumstances change in the Georgia quarterback backfield. He knows Georgia's going to recruit another high-profile quarterback the year behind him. He knows he's got to compete in practices with Stetson Bennett and Jake Fromm. He knows his role, and he's anxious. He's ready to embrace it. The family had never been to Athens. They trusted Dwan on his word about Athens, Georgia, and about the Georgia campus. Now, Terrence Mathis is his father. I had a chance to check in with him just real quick yesterday, and he's absolutely thrilled with the opportunity. He loves the school. The family couldn't be more excited about Dwan being at the University of Georgia, and Dwan feels the same way. And here's the thing: he's 6'6", he's 210. That's the same size as Trevor Lawrence, but Dwan is a little more raw. Okay, he's got a big arm, but I think Coley's going to work with him. You're going to see him improve. He's got to add weight. He's very well aware of that. He does have great mobility and running skills, but Dwan wants to be a more efficient passer. His numbers from high school are very good. He played at a very competitive level. He's coming from the same program that John Kelly, the former Tennessee running back, played for there in Oak Park. It's kind of a traditional power. Um, in terms of the proximity to Detroit, maybe a Marietta, something like that. So he's been playing some great Metro football throughout his high school career, and he's a guy that I can't wait for y'all to see this video we did in his home just last week. It's been a bit of a whirlwind. So I'm out here in California. You've seen some of the stories I've done with Trevor Lawrence, Nick Saban, kind of localizing these stories today. I want to do a story where I talked with Tua as well as Jalen Hurts about these quarterback competitions, because the Justin Fields, Jake Fromm story, this is just the first of many. We're going to see a lot of high-profile quarterback competitions now. The transfers, the transfer portal, this is a part of the game. I talked with Greg Sankey about this as well. I'll have a story with the SEC commissioner about the transfer rules, about his thoughts on that, and of course the playoff. I asked Bill Hancock, the director of the college football playoff, directly about Georgia Tech and Florida having athletic directors on the board that made a decision that had a direct effect on Georgia. You're going to want to see what he had to say. And Chris Fowler, of course, we all know Chris from ESPN. He had some fascinating things to say about the potential expansion of the playoff, a point he made. While we all sit back and say we want 8 teams, well, what would that mean? Would it mean that, maybe a team like Pitt, had they upset Clemson, the first round game would be Pitt at Alabama in Tuscaloosa? And Chris said, yeah, I'd watch it, but how realistic is that? In other words, Chris believes, and one of the things to think about is even if you went from 4 to 8, would you end up with the same teams playing for the championship? And if so, is there a need for expansion? So there's a lot of different directions that conversation can go. We can find all the faults in the 4 playoff system without really thinking about the problems that we might have with an 8 playoff system. How excited would people be about a three-loss team? What would that do to diminish the regular season? So a lot of different things bouncing around out here in San Jose, California. Today is the first day the sun's come out. It's been rainy and cool weather. They've had a tarp on the field. The tarp the grass that they're putting in, this is new grass. They don't expect there to be any problems with the playing surface tonight. Clemson very optimistic that they can play with Alabama. I'll be curious to see how that holds up. I think the Alabama team is too strong at the line of scrimmage. We'll see what happens with the Crimson Tide and the Clemson Tigers tonight. And I'll continue to work on these stories about Georgia football. I'll get that story done on Mel Tucker. You can hear what Mel had to say about Georgia today. And you can read more on dognation.com or follow me on Twitter at Mike Griffith 32. So thanks for joining me today on the Ingles on the Beat segment from right here in San Jose, California, the home base of the college football playoff, at least for a few more hours. And I'll be on that flight back to Atlanta tomorrow. Everybody have a great Monday night.